Welcome everyone to round number 10 overview of the Candidates Tournament theoretical overview. My name is Dian Boshkov, I'm Grandmaster from Bulgaria. We'll have a look at all the games, all the full games. This is probably one of the most important rounds played so far, as it's becoming clear that Nepomniachtchi will be almost certainly the winner of the tournament. Still there are 4 more rounds to go, but he's 1.5 points now away from the other contenders. He played a very solid game with the white pieces today versus Timur Radjabov, so basically he chose the ultra solid Catalan opening. And nowadays this line with b5 is extremely popular, as you know, at the top level. A few years back it was considered almost automatical that black should be playing the move a6 before pushing the pawn on b5. What's funny about this line is that it was first played back in 1947 in a Bulgarian tournament between 2 Bulgarian players, Benderov versus Bardarov. But the thing is that black didn't quite understand the idea behind the move, so he decided to defend here with the move c6, and after the capture on b5 he lost the exchange with knight g5. Typical trick, very typical for the Queen's Union defense as well. And okay, even though black saved eventually the game, it wasn't his fault that he saved the game. Now, besides the move that Radjabov played bishop b7 here, b4 is the other choice. Magnus Carlsen played like that against Dinkley Ren. That game continued like this, c5, and with very unclear, very active play by black, they reached the following position. This is all having a huge computer flavor. Is everywhere nowadays in all the lines. Bishop b7 looks more in the human area, and after ab5 the move a6. So basically black is trying to use some little tactics. Instant capture on c4 obviously impossible because of the recapture on b5, to trade as many pawns as he can. And in this game white continued with the move knight c3. I'm pretty sure that you have also seen this recent effort by the world champion, where he basically summarized the whole game as it's very rare to prepare something and to see it happening. Actually, it happened like this. Excuse me, I messed up the move order. So instead of bishop e3 in this situation, bishop f4 was Magnus's novelty against the same Radjabov just a few days ago at the no HS, and after knight e4 queen c1 at the capture on d4, he said the following in the post-game interview: it's very rare that you follow a plan from move 1 and it just works perfectly. I took a pawn in the opening and defended it in a very, very ugly way, and that passed pawn won me the game. So basically what later happened was that somehow Magnus managed to bring his pieces on the proper squares, and even though black always had seemingly enough compensation, in the end of the day Magnus managed to win this game. Okay, Magnus can win any position, this one we know, and on the top of that, if Radjabov is repeating the same idea, obviously he is quite well prepared for the game, so Nepomniachtchi decided not to test him, and he chose instead of that the move knight c3, which can be considered the main line here. After all the massive trades, black plays the move bishop d5. He is set for the move c5, which will generally kill all the queenside pawns, almost all of them. There will be still a little bit of a problem with the pawn on c4, as it is a little bit more exposed than the other pawns. And this is exactly what Nepomniachtchi will try to somehow make use of, and he's testing the opponent with the move bishop f4, c5, dc5, and then he goes for black went for the move queen a5. Nepomniachtchi himself has played this position, but he has chosen the move bishop takes c5. And then knight c3 happened in this game against FIDE. It ended in a quick draw after knight c6, bishop g5, bishop takes f3, and then knight e4. Everything is traded, so the draw is a very normal result at this point. But it's interesting to test the computer continuation here at the move b3. That the machine is strongly suggesting, with some complications which seem to favor white in this particular case. So I guess Black was aware of that, and Radjabov went for queen a5. And now after knight c3, he took on c5 with the queen, which looks more solid. He needs some extra protection for the pawn on c4. And here comes Nepomniachtchi's idea for this game. He played the move bishop e3. Prior to this game, there were a lot of games of Nakamura in this line, by the way. So Nakamura has faced the move e4 in this situation against Dubov. And then after knight d4, rook c8, h3, and bishop e8, little by little he managed to equalize, even though at some point he had to retreat with the knight on d7. But generally in this line, as long as the knight comes on the d3 square for the second player, it seems like he is doing perfectly fine. Rook c1 on move number 16 has also been tested. Very straightforward move. Eyeballing the pawn on c4 makes perfect sense, but black is not obstructed in his development, and Dink against Nakamura also got nothing. He took on d5, pawn took back, and after b3, knight b4, now this little move is practically forcing the draw. So white cannot capitalize on this pin in this particular case. And one more thing that I want to mention after the move queen c5, if white goes directly for the move knight takes d5, then black is going to take back with the knight, and on bishop d2, which is stopping the generally desirable trait with the move c3 as well, or at least it intends to stop it. Then besides the move rook c8, there is the move knight e7, played by the same Nakamura against Vidit, and after rook c1, rook c8, e3, and bishop f6, as you can see, black is generating enough pressure on the queen side to secure the trade of these two pawns. He might be even looking for something more if white is not careful, some knight b4 stuff later, maybe hitting that pawn with knight a4 as well, with the queen coming on b4. So what's the point behind bishop e3, behind Nepomniachtchi's novelty? Since the queen has to stay somewhere on the queen side, black apparently has no other square but the a5-1, no better square than the a5-1. But then the bishop is coming back on d2, and basically white is doing the so-called disappearing move. He is trying to win the tempo by moving the bishop, always chasing the queen, moving it on the proper square, so that anytime he takes on d5, the opponent is not taking back with the tempo and hitting the bishop on the f4 square. For instance, this would have happened in case that black decided to repeat the moves with queen c5, hoping for the draw, but then white can simply take on d5, and after knight takes d5, rook c1, as you can see there is no knight f4, unlike that game of Vidit versus Nakamura, and rook c8 would be met with knight e5, which looks quite unpleasant for the second player, and something similar happened a little bit later in the game. Now, therefore, it makes sense for that bishop to retreat. In the game, it retreated to a strangely looking a8 square, so basically black is trying not to distract his pieces, not to obstruct the defense of the pawn on c4 neither, but probably bishop c6 would have been a little bit easier for Radjabov, because then after knight d1, the maneuver that happened in the game, he will have rook c8, and on rook c1 he can go bishop e4. Not that he didn't have this in the game, he had it after bishop e8. But after knight d1, which is again obviously part of Nepomniachtchi's preparation, and very good looking maneuver. As we said, the main problem for the second player is the pawn on c4, so therefore it makes sense to throw in every single piece that he has into the attack of that pawn. Now, for some reason, Radjabov came back with the queen on c5, which seemingly wasn't very accurate. Queen a6 wasn't the spirit of the position, obviously, and then bishop e4 coming in the proper moment, which looks pretty even. Or, okay, there are still some problems for black, but not as many as they were after the move queen c5, when knight e3, rook c8, and rook c1 led to very pleasant position for the first player, for Nepomniachtchi, after the capture and knight e5. The pawn on c4 is definitely difficult to protect. Knight b6 is the only move, and here it seems like the Russian player missed a good chance to claim the advantage by playing the move bishop b7. Bishop b7 was likely the way to do it, as suggested by the computer, with the point that if queen takes e5, he can capture on c8, and after knight c8 and queen c4, he's looking for a favorable endgame with a rook and an outside passer versus these two knights. Had this had happened, most likely black would have had difficult time defending this position, so bishop b7 at this point could have led to white's advantage. Nepomniachtchi played queen to e4, and then after some further moves, black managed to trade as he wanted to, many pieces, and the game petered out into a draw. This was the fastest game of the round, and we are moving to the second fastest game between Nakamura and Firouzja, where apparently Firouzja decided to go all in and to try to play for the win with the black pieces. So he decided to risk, and he went for the Najdorf rather than any other solid opening line. But I have the feeling that Nakamura surprised him in return by choosing this relatively silent line with the move knight f3. This is the positional line against this in the English attack. So instead of the knight moving back to the b3 square, which is the typical English attack, followed by a3, g4, etc., and white is going bananas on the king side, and he's trying to checkmate the opponent. This is having a far more positional flavor. One notable name here to mention with the white pieces is Grandmaster Najdorf. He is quite a decent player with the white pieces in this line, and I just want to show you one of his recent efforts from the freshly finished Team Championship of France. So here he is conducting the typical idea for white in all the Najdorfs, but in this one in particular it is a very common thing, and that is to trade the right pieces and to occupy the d5 square with the knight. So he did bishop g5, apparently looking for a good moment to trade on f6 and then to get this domination. And look at this move. Rook takes d5, very unpleasant for Musar. Playing with the black pieces, he jumped knight c4, and after bishop f6, and rook d3, again speculating with the knight d5 threat all the time. Najdorf managed to stabilize the position, brought the knight on d5, and at this point he already had very serious, I would say after the massive trades on a8 and g3, I would say close to decisive positional advantage with the super knight versus the poor bishop on f6. So next he can, if he wishes, he can take away more squares from the knight, but ultimately from the bishop, excuse me, but ultimately his idea would be to bring this knight somehow to the d5 square. He can do it in various ways, in various paths. He can choose plus besides the d5 square, the weakness of the pawn on d6, there is also weakness of a pawn on b5. Typically white is playing in these positions for two weaknesses. One is obviously the d5 square, and then he's looking for a weakness side on the queen side, on the king side where the opponent's king might get checkmated after the advance of the pawns. So Firouzja is choosing, instead of this, the move knight c6, and knight c6 is not the most typical Najdorf move, as you can guess. The problem for Firouzja is not that he is choosing something rare. There is a more important problem. He's choosing it after thinking for quite a long time. And it seems like he had prepared something, but he forgot those things during the game. And here comes the move knight e5, and likely knight e5 is the only realistic try for white to play for the advantage in this particular case. Bishop b3, as has been proved on a couple of occasions at least, and one of the games is the game between Nepomniachtchi, is allowing black a chance to first of all trade this b3 bishop for the knight, and then even though white is still occupying the d5 square, the presence of the second bishop, the light squared bishop, is promising black enough counterplay in the Sveshnikov style with the bishop g5 move. This is the game between Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces versus Andrenasyan, so typical Sveshnikov-like position where black is trying to attack on the king side and has strong presence in the center. Judith Polgar also didn't get anything in this position, anything specific after bishop to h5, g5, excuse me, for there is the move knight h5, typical maneuver for black as well. It's far more important to keep this knight alive than the bishop on e7, and after bishop takes, queen takes, and rook d1, rook d8, queen e3 and knight a5, the Turkish grandmaster Yilmaz already had quite a nice position, in my opinion, as he's keeping enough pieces to protect the d5 square and to fight against the opponent's strong pieces. So knight d5 obviously is not losing the pawn with knight d4 because of the typical threat of bishop b6. And as well, after knight d5, black is not really keen on trading twice, as we see that white is still in full control of the d5 square, and he has the good bishop versus the bad pawn on f8, which is another dream position for him. So Firouzja is going for rook c8, and he starts eyeballing the pawn on c2 and the bishop on c4. So the trades on d5 followed by knight b4 are on the agenda, but Nakamura is careful. He takes on f6. He wants to trade his knight anyway. And here, a strange novelty by Firouzja. This is why I said that he was probably remembering some things, but maybe he mixed a few lines. Gf6 is a novelty which most likely will not attract new followers. Queen f6 has been tried before that by Bologan against Adams, and then that game continued with bishop e6. Pawn takes, of course. Black is just filling those holes on d5 and f5, and after queen g6 followed by bishop e7, black got quite a normal, quite a decent position with the move bishop g5. Another attempt after queen f6 is to go bishop to d5, and probably this is where either Firouzja forgot his line or he couldn't figure out what's happening after knight b4. White has a couple of tries. First of all, bishop b7 doesn't seem very convincing, because after this capture and rook c7 is important, then it doesn't seem like black has any problems and white will be having enough compensation for the exchange. So therefore, most likely white has to play something different, like c4. And then in this line, black can win a pawn, but it looks a little bit scary for him with the knight on the rim on b4, ready to get trapped. Queen b3 is a strong threat, a3 is simple, could be a threat as well. Rook c1 looks like a strong threat, but the fearless computer says, okay, you can play like this, and after rook c8, in case of rook c1, you have queen f5. And exactly on that square, you're defending the c2 knight, you're defending the c8 rook, and if queen to e2 takes, even though black is lagging in development, that's something that happens actually quite often in the Najdorf. He is still doing fine because of the knight c4, queen d8, and queen g4. There is the move h5. And now black has a choice between the immediate g6 or first the preliminary for preparing g6 and then bishop g7, or g6 and bishop e7, depending on the circumstances. So yeah, he's lagging in development, but there is nothing really decisive for white. No immediate way to destroy the opponent. Whereas g takes f6, that was played in the game. Okay, first of all, bishop d5 would be a horrible mistake for white. Maybe I really doubt that Firouzja was realistically hoping that this will happen, as after the check followed by knight e7, the pawn on d5 drops. But the simple bishop to b3 that was played in the game is just leaving black with too many holes, not only the one on d5, but there is the one on f5, and after knight e7, one more inaccuracy. Probably this should have been a try, but objectively white is already much better at this point, as there is no problem with the pawn on c2. He may continue bishop c2, he may continue with bishop d5, and in either case these pawns, they don't look very convincing, and of course the king is suffering because of that. So this knight e7 was met with short castle, and no matter if they trade on b3 and they go d5 or they go directly d5, it's all the same, black is in trouble. If d5 directly, capture, and anytime black takes on e3, there is the simple fe3 followed by e4 and light square domination. This king has nowhere to hide. It should be mated. Whereas if bishop takes b3, which was played in the game, then there is the simple a takes b3 followed by capture, queen e2, and again the sounder pawn structure, but above all the safer position of the white king It has promised Nakamura very beautiful position, large advantage that he went on to convert. Next game in line is the game between Duda with the white pieces versus Caruana. The Italian game is the new Ruy Lopez nowadays, obviously, so it's gaining more and more popularity, and I think it's nowadays even more popular than the Ruy Lopez on top level, as it is at least avoiding the Berlin after bishop a7, typical move which is stepping away from the possible attacks. Rook e1, short castle has been played, and this is one of the modern tabias. Black has a lot of moves in this situation. h6 is one of the main lines. When black is developing like this, sometimes like in the game between Nepomniachtchi against Giri. Another way is to go king h8. Also quite a standard idea for black. And this happened in the game between Karekin and Wesley So. Like this. And f5 looks already good for black. And there is also the move 97, which is I think it's still the main line. And 97 after 90 to 96 and knight f1 is leading to a very symmetrical looking position, but this is also quite a tabia nowadays. The question is, who is the first one to push the d pawn? Is it going to be black or is it going to be white? But often this clash of the pawns in the center results in massive trades and a draw. But not always. Sometimes it is black who is taking first on d4 and then he receives e5 and then this capture, which was again another game of Wesley So, this time against Nihal Sarin. Caruana has chosen another move though. He has chosen the move bishop e6, which makes a lot of sense with the bishop on c4. If it is on b3, white is often just moving the bishop backwards on the c2 square in this position, and then he's trying to make use of the presence of the bishop on e6 by attacking with the advance of the d pawn. The capture that Duda is executing was not considered to be interesting for the first player for a very long time. In fact, many people were considering this just to be very good for black, myself included. I actually like playing like this. This is a chameleon type of position in the Italian, because often white is going bishop e3 first, and after the trade fe3 with the rook on f1, they are attacking in exactly the same way on the king side. I have tried this plan with the white pieces multiple times, and I think it's generally much easier for the first player to play like this. By the way, if you remember the Bologan's game from before against Adams, and if we take away that pawn and this one, we will see that the pawn structure is very similar. So I would say that the fact that white is trying to squeeze anything from this position, a little bit of this position, is a sign that that the chances nowadays, the theoretical chances, are getting very even, and they are basically trying to squeeze mud from to squeeze water from any stone nowadays at the top level. Anyway, Duda managed to squeeze some water here, so he played the move b4, and after knight h5 he came up with a novelty knight e2. Funny thing is that prior to this game there was a game between Mr. Caruana himself with the white pieces, where he has chosen the generally useful move, protecting the pawn on f2 against Grigor. That game continued in an instructive way. Queen e8 as we expect. Knight a3 is preparing the move b5. Knight f4. Now bishop takes, rook takes, as he really needs to attack on the king side. And besides, after e takes f4, there is the move d4, which is basically trapping the bishop on a7, something that black cannot afford. So he took on f4 with the rook. Knight c4 has been played, followed by b5. And Grigor managed to bring this rook into the game just in time. Notice that this was a blitz game. And he definitely managed to avoid the consequences on the e file after the move b6, when his position would have collapsed. So Grigor was in time to play rook a to f8. And after knight d2, 97, and d4, Caruana was once again trying to block the bishop, but he failed to do so for just a move. And eventually they entered this position where, even though black's position on the queen side looks suspect, white has a lot of things to worry about on the opposite side, and eventually in the time trouble, Grigor managed to trick his opponent. But what's the point behind the move knight e2? That's a very good question, actually. Well, obviously it's a developing move, but what's more, now Duda actually has some tricky things on his mind. In particular, after knight f4 and knight f1, what happened in the game, I think, was already very, very good for the first player. He was given a chance to trade the very mighty knight on f4, and of course he took this chance. Just like Caruana also did something similar, and he was hoping for that one to block the opponent's bishop with the move d4. We are seeing that one in the game as well. Except that in Caruana's game, if you remember, Grigor took back on f4 with the rook here. Black has to take back with the queen. And this is not exactly the ideal setup for the second player as we're about to see it. And this is why I think that for Caruana it would have been a much better way to continue like this, with queen e8 followed by queen g6. So having that file open for the rook would have been useful for him. Knight f4 is coming anyway. And what's more, he doesn't really have to worry about the queen side, at least for the time being, because after the trade on b5, he can go for knight a5. And everything seems in order on the queen side. So this was the type of position that he should have been heading for. Yeah, the knight on a5 doesn't seem great, but how exactly is white going to make use of that is not very clear. His knights on the king side are also not the best ones, and above all, this bishop is still opened, and obviously white always has to reckon with some nasty little ideas on the king side. In comparison, after knight f1 and queen f6 takes, now queen b3 is very unpleasant. And once again, Caruana, I believe, committed an inaccuracy, which is not very typical for him, as we know how well prepared he is. Rook f6 or rook e8, they would have led to the same thing. In the game, rook f6 has been chosen, but I think queen f7 was the best way here for black to play, even though it's so counterintuitive, and even though white also looks somewhat better in that position after rook e2 or rook e2. This was the way to do it. Queen h6, not so accurate after knight 1 to h2 and followed by knight g4. And the rook moves rook f6. I think probably just a mistake, as the rook is never going to be in time to attack on the king side. Now comes b5 as expected. Knight f5, queen e2. Next g5, very aggressive, but knight 1 to h2 is cool in the spirit of the position and white's plans. And besides the obvious knight g4 threat, it is creating one more threat, namely the threat of d4. Once again blocking the bishop, and what's more, not only blocking the bishop, but in case of this capture, he can even trap the queen on f4. So that's why the knight is there. It is not only stopping the move g4, it is defending the knight on f3, and it can eventually help white to trap the queen. And something similar happened after the move rook g6 in the game. Then d4 is still there, still g3 is on the agenda. h5 was met with g3, and after queen f6, rook d1, Duda was in full control. He was just in time to block the bishop on a7. This is what happens in this opening nowadays. It's all about 1-2 moves, the nuances, and deciding the outcome of the opening battle. And here with the maneuvers of the queen capture on f6, then on f4, and then back, Caruana simply lost too much valuable time. The last game from today was the game between Rapport and Ren. This time it was Ruy Lopez, and it wasn't Berlin, surprisingly, and nevertheless white opted for the d3 line. So still a position which resembles the Italian game. d6 played c3, and black's choice was to go back with the bishop on a7. Bishop b6 is also possible, as Carlsen played against Pragnanda recently. Short castle, knight a5, and bishop c2. Up to here, there was just one game played so far. Now, I forgot to mention one important thing about this position. Usually, white is playing the move bishop g5 before he castles, and he's trying to delay the castling. so that in case of g5 he can counterattack with h4 himself, but here he didn't have quite a choice. Black on his turn is also trying to delay the castling and to go for g5 once the opponent castles on the short side. So here g5 in this particular case has been played already by Burke against Caruana, and g5 wasn't quite a great move, or turned out not to be quite a great move after the move a4. And Caruana immediately created problems to the opponent on the other side. Knight g3 was met with the move h takes g3. And now Burke missed a chance to sort of try and to keep the things leveled on the queen side. The typical move b4 he either didn't see or he underestimated. Such an idea is very common against the d3 real opposites. cb4 could have been met with knight c6, and after b5 knight e7, black is just going to regain the pawn later, or he is going to sacrifice in a banker spirit way, and he'll be having decent chances on the king side. So knight g6 will be on the agenda, h5 and h4, etc. This would have been quite interesting for the second player. He, however, have chosen to retreat with the knight on c6, and after ab5 and ab5 knight a3 he went bishop a6 to defend the pawn on b5, but then bishop came out on b3, and that was already quite difficult for black to defend. He cannot castle short, or he doesn't like to castle short, and at the same time he has to take care of the move bishop d5. If he retreats and takes care of that square, then there will be the move d4, and okay, his queen side is once again burning, whereas the king side is also completely wrecked. All of this is not something that anyone will expect to be repeated at the top level. And Dinkley came first with a novelty by pushing the pawn on c5. So the same policy, he's trying not to castle yet with his bishop on g4. He's patiently waiting for the moment to push the pawn on g5. And that moment happened actually on the next move. Bishop g3 met with knight h5. And now the difference in comparison to Caruana's game is that if a4, black can go for b4 himself. And he is not worried about this queenside expansion. There is no d4, there is no opening of the game on the queen side, so this is why Rapport is adopting a different approach, and he is going for the move a3, preparing the move b4, and then depending on the circumstances, a4, c4, bishop b3. And now comes another instructive maneuver by the Chinese grandmaster. One would expect something along the lines of bishop a6 here, followed by bishop b3, which looks like a normal play for both sides, but okay, white can most likely be just happy with the opening development. But Dinkley is trying to solve once again of the problem of his further development, and he believes that the bishop on c8 is already doing an excellent job. He is looking at his pieces, which of them can do better, and he decided, okay, my rook can do better. I can improve my queen side by playing the move rook b8. Then he is anticipating b4, and b4 he plans either to take first and then to take second time on b4 and go knight c6, or without a capture on b4 to go knight c6 directly. And once more he is looking for a chance to start an immediate expansion on the king side. Sometimes this king would be suffering because of that pen, because of the x-raying power of the bishop, and this is why Rapport himself moves the king out of the way of the bishop. Makes perfect sense. But then look at Dinkley play, rook b7. This rook is coming out slowly, and he keeps the bishop where it is on the c8 square. In the process, he is overprotecting the pawn on b7, and that's a brilliant idea in my opinion. So he's just making music with his rook right now, and the rook is coming on c7, and black is, I believe he's doing fine. One thing to mention about these positions with the rook on c7, as I said, he's protecting the pawn on f7, and sometimes this pawn can be in danger. So let's say that black does something like knight e7, something cooperative, then this idea might be working for the first player. Take a bunch of pawns with tempi, go knight f3, take threat on e5, then try to open up the position with f4 could be a very beautiful play for the first player. So this is why Ding goes for g4. Short castle was good as well, and taking on b4 and short castle, according to the computer, those were already good follow-ups. But he is still keeping the strict policy of non-castling and trying to make the opponent on the other side of the board, which eventually allowed Rapport a chance to play creatively. With bishop h4, sacrifice the pawn like this. He took in this direction, and this all led to extremely double-edged position, where definitely white has pressure against the opponent's king, which remained in the center, and this is worth the pawn. But what exactly happened afterwards, you will check for yourselves. In any case, the opening was, I would say, successful black, as well for white too, as they were both obviously searching for trouble. They were looking for very interesting double-edged play, and you will check later what happened in this game. For the time being, I'm signing off. I thank you all for watching this, and I hope that you will be enjoying beautiful finish of the tournament as much as I will.